I always wanted to make a film about that period, and I had a very hard time finding the proper material. When I read The Pianist, I knew right away that that's something I wanted to do. And the reason was that the description of the events was extremely accurate, and that's because it was written immediately after the war. I don't think that somebody who writes a book about the events 20 or 30 years later can have the same type of recollections, the same type of detail, which was vividly true to me, a child of the same period.
I think what's wonderful about this story is that it's not a general perspective of it, but it focuses on one man's struggle and one man's strength through all of that.
It's about survival, survival of human being, the strength of the will to live against this terrible adversity, terrible horror.
The film is terrible, but it's optimistic. When you have the power and when you really want it, you can survive. Survive to everything, survive to the normal life every day, which is difficult, but survive also to extraordinary events. So I think it's a message of hope.
The book is written with astonished and cold objectivity. There are good Jews and bad Jews in the film, and that's how it was. There are good Germans and bad Germans. There are good Poles and bad Poles. And above all, the book is tremendously optimistic. The victim survives thanks to his passion for the art and for the music in particular, thanks to his willpower. It's an optimistic and uplifting book in spite of the horrors that it describes.
From what I can deduct from his memoirs, at the point where the story takes place, he was just a very outgoing, kind of good-hearted young man. Everything was taken from him, and everyone else. But what I learned about Spielmann after surviving all this is that he grew to have a very long life with a lovely wife who I've met, and he had a family and continued to compose and contribute all kinds of wonderful things. And Roman had a lot of similarities, so I got to envision Spielmann like Roman.
All my family was killed. My father survived a very hard concentration camp, Mauthausen in Austria. I hardly talked to my father about those times, but sometimes we would touch the subject, and what I got was the strength that helped him to survive is that he wanted to see me. He knew he had a child outside, and he wanted desperately to see Germany collapse. I was a kid, and I wanted to live. I wanted to see my parents. Among all possible type of suffering, the greatest was the separation from the parents. I think for the child, this is the saddest and most tragic, I would say, thing. Lack of comfort, hunger, whatever. It's absolutely secondary. But the longing to see my father walking in the snow towards me, that was the real sad thing. Wanting to see my mother, who was taken there first.
It's a funny time to say this.
What?
I wish I knew you better.
There are a lot of similarities, but great differences too. Warsaw Ghetto lasted much longer than the Krakow. The Warsaw Ghetto lingered, and they let people literally starve to death within the walls. The Warsaw Ghetto was much bigger. It held at the beginning 360,000, and since the Germans were filling it up with all kinds of Jews from Europe, not only those who lived in Warsaw previously, it grew up to 500,000, and those people were dying on the streets. It was living a life of a community, so there were some people who were better off. There was someone who were crawling on the pavement. But it was a city in itself. And then they started deporting people to the death camps and brought it down to about 60,000. Then those 60,000 managed to organize themselves, and they were the fittest, because of course the Germans would first deport the old and sick and children. So they started the uprising. From that uprising, only a handful survived. Spielmann went through all that period. Here's the difference. I ran from the Krakow ghetto, first to a family in the city of Krakow, and very soon to a peasant family in the country, virtually medieval. He survived in the ruins of the capital. We try to change as little as possible. We try to stick to the line of the book. But of course, to make a movie of it, you need the action. Very often, the events which were described, almost always, are not written like a novel, but they are all rather written like a journal, therefore unfilmable. So we had to give it a shape. We had to describe the concrete situations of which he speaks in his memoir. I think we are very faithful to the book.
It's a dreadful historical event, and you can't start glamorizing it, you can't start trying to soften it, you have to tell it as you believe it is. I mean, there is no ultimate truth of it because nobody can really, we can't explain it in any way, so the truth is very difficult to get at. But whatever the truth is in you of that subject, in one, you have to be true to that truth.
Not only that you need a good script and a good writer who knows how to write about these events, but also because it's a very difficult period for the head. Where you write the script, you recollect, you come back to certain things. You study the films, the archives, and there are masses of them, the photographs. And this is very hard. And it's better to have someone with whom you want to go through all this mental or moral, or whatever you call it, psychological exercise. Ronnie Howard is a perfect man for it. First of all, he has a great sense of humor. And all I remember is that we used to laugh all the time. It was a great fun, but there were moments, you know, where either he or I had tears in our eyes when we were really shaken. One observation that I made going through this archive footage and through the photographs, in which you can see most horrific things, is that when you watch it on the screen, you sometimes come out trembling. You forgot about one thing, that there must have been someone behind the camera who was actually filming all these horrors, photographing all this stuff. The people who are doing it were German Nazis. I put a crew in one scene, it's just a brief moment in the film, but even in this archive material, we can see German unit filming. So there must have been more than one. And they were doing it with gusto or with passion, or maybe they were doing it just cool to record for their military purpose. Difficult for me to understand, but some of those scenes are even staged. They were actually recording their masterpiece.
Roman, don't forget, was, of course, a wonderful touchstone because it had happened to him, but in Krakow. This is set in Warsaw. So I always had him as my yardstick.
He's been there. He lived there. He was a child. He saw his mother taken to Auschwitz, never coming back. He lived through all this horror.
Many people ask me, how difficult was it for you to shoot this type of film, to come back to the events of this sort that you went through? How difficult was it on this set? And the answer right away, it was not difficult at all. You're dealing with artifacts on the set. You're dealing with people who are disguised actors. You have all crew around you, behind you. Although you don't see it on the screen, there are hundreds behind. Technically, it was very difficult to shoot this film in Warsaw, but it seemed to me essential that the film is made in Warsaw. Certain scenes of the picture happen in pre-war Warsaw, the others in the ruins of Warsaw. Neither of this exists. Warsaw was totally razed by the Nazis. First, there was the bombardment of the Warsaw, then there was a ghetto uprising, then there was a Polish uprising, and then eventually, whatever has left from it after the Germans evacuated, the entire population was destroyed with dynamite and flamethrowers. So after the war, there was nothing. And what you have around you here in Warsaw, it was rebuilt, and it's a different type of architecture. With an exception of one area on the other side of the river, where Soviet army sat on their asses and waited until the Polish uprising will be put down, because it was not a communist uprising and they wouldn't help them. That part of Warsaw, a very small area called Praga, has buildings and streets of the period. They're full still of impacts of the shrapnels, etc., but they stand. So we used that part for certain scenes from before the war with great help of our production designer, Alan Starsky, who built the ghetto walls around it and who put some buildings in the areas where there were new modern buildings. So that part was recreated, but with really great difficulties.
I was afraid that it could be annoying for people living in some areas that we are building, we are shooting during the night and all these things. But all people were moved by the images from the war, this is first. And the young people, because of the name of Roman Polański, were pretty excited when they are looking for what we are doing. So it was pretty good for us to work in Warsaw.
We were very apprehensive because that part of Warsaw is inhabited by very rough trade, but we didn't have any difficulties with them. It seems that even they were in tune with our movie.